It's a new year, I've got a new jumper, but there's one thing missing. I need a new OS. Welcome to Jim's Garage Community Linux Switch. This is the first video in a many-part series where I'll be documenting my journey from Windows over to Linux. And this isn't just me talking about my experiences. This is a community event. I want all of you lot to come with me on this journey, and those that already have done, please feel free to contribute and help make our lives easier. I have a few things planned, predominantly around communication via Discord. I want us to have a repository on GitHub for common scenarios. Things like which apps work, which apps are good replacements for things you can't replace. Things like good hardware, because certain drivers aren't going to be available. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. Let's step this back. I'm going to talk you through why and how, and then we're going to get on to installing Linux Mint on this video. If you want to skip ahead from me rambling and get onto the installation, check the chapters out down below. So for those of you who've stuck around, what are we actually going to be doing here? Well, if you're anything like me, you've been using Windows probably for most of your life, and it's about time that I saw what's on the other side. Historically, and I'm talking probably a decade or so ago, Linux was difficult. It's not as difficult right now, and that's great because it's going to aid our transition. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a number of quirks, there are things that simply will not work, hence why I want this to be a community event. But I thought I can't be somebody who loves technology without trying out the Linux UI. Now, as you know from my channel and when I've spoken about my experiences in the past, I'm very familiar with the Linux server environment. I've been running it for many years, both personally, and I'm quite familiar with it through the workplace. But the actual desktop is something that I've always sort of put off. But that changes today, because I want to be transitioning over to Linux to really try and see if I can get on board with it. I want to break free of all the Windows guff that's coming down the pipeline, things like TPMs, things like recall, things like invasive AI, which is just a privacy nightmare. I really want to see if I can actually move over to something where those aren't a concern anymore. Now, I know this is going to be difficult off the bat. I've already done some homework, and one of the first things I recommend you do is look at the machine that you're planning to install this on and check the hardware. Make sure that drivers are available. For instance, I'm actually recording this on my current device, the one that I've done all my videos on, but I already know that the Elgato Stream, the thing that's actually capturing my ugly mugger at the moment, that does not have drivers within Linux. So that's going to be something I'm going to have to factor in. Now, one of the things I will mention off the bat is we are going to be doing a dual boot. I'm a firm believer that if you're going to do a massive change, make it as achievable as possible. We want to break this down into bite-sized steps. You don't want to go cold turkey and switch, find that nothing works exactly at the point when you need it most, and thus you're just going to cave and switch back. Now, there are a couple of ways in which we can achieve a dual boot scenario. We can use a single drive and we can install both OSs onto that. That's okay if you've only got one drive, but there have been recent issues where updates to Windows, for example, around TPMs and things like that, it gets complicated and it can actually break that dual boot notion. Now, as we're trying to replace our desktop, where probably productivity and sensitive files are important files nonetheless, we want to make sure that we've got uptime, productivity, all of those sorts of things. So with that in mind, and taking advantage of devices nowadays that have multiple NVMe drives, but even if you haven't, things like a traditional SSD are going to be fine. So I'm grabbing myself another PC, a small form factor in this case, with multiple NVMe drives. But like I say, even if you don't have NVMe drives, any sort of SATA connection, whatever it is, the goal here really is to get Linux up and running, to try it out and see how it fits. The beauty of having two discrete drives means that those drives aren't going to interfere with one another. We can seamlessly boot between, and I'll show how to do that. And it means that we've got something that's even more portable as well. We're not confined to two OSs on one drive. Now, if you do want to use a single drive or only have one drive available, that's fine. You can get this up and running, and there's a great demonstration of how to do that over at Learn Linux TV, and I'll link that in the description below. Basically, it's going to be the same process as we're following here, but simply when you go through the installation process, you're going to select the existing drive. Fortunately, Linux Mint takes care of that. Did I just say Linux Mint? I did. Linux Mint is the operating system I've chosen for this. And I know there are a few topics in the home lab world that are more sensitive, more emotive than which distro you're going to use. Now, I've chosen Linux Mint after quite a bit of research because it seems to be the most Windows-like, seems to have one of the largest communities, and seems to be the most well-supported from what I've seen. Now that makes a lot of sense to me because we want this transition to be as seamless as possible. And so picking something with the greatest support makes a lot of sense to me. Now, once you've learned and you're up and running and you're comfortable with Linux, obviously you could transition to other distributions. But just know that under the hood, this is basically Ubuntu, which is running on Debian. But as you know, there are other distributions out there, things like Fedora, etc. Now, I will say I've done a little bit of testing in the past few days, and that's primarily so that I have an idea of what I'm talking about and I can make this introductory video a bit more informative and also hopefully help you to evade some of the headaches that I had. Things like, for example, not knowing that I had drivers for my devices. You really want to go and check just to make sure that your device is compatible first. And the good news is that with Linux Mint, you can actually boot that up in a live mode to check your hardware requirements. Anyway, now let's get on to the installation process. For this, you're going to need to download Linux Mint, and we're going to need to make that bootable via something like Rufus or Etcher, and we want to put that onto a USB stick. So if we just head over to Linux Mint Home, and the version we're going to be downloading is the latest version, which is Linux Mint 22. Now, you can obviously read through the download instructions and the installation steps, etc., but I'm going to talk you through it anyway. So, if we're ready to download, let's choose which edition we want. Now, the edition we're going to be using is the Cinnamon edition, just because it's kind of the most popular and the most Windows-esque looking. Now, again, it's not just distributions. People get quite caught up on what the user interface is. I'm going to keep this simple. I'm going to go with the top one, the one that's most popular, and that is Cinnamon. But do bear in mind, just from a knowledge perspective, just like you have different distributions, you can have different front ends, different user experiences. And as we get more down this Linux journey, that's something that you'll become more comfortable with. So we're going to click Cinnamon Edition. We're going to begin that download process. And once it's finished, we should be in a good spot. So if you scroll down, choose a mirror that's closest to you and hit that download link. I'm going to choose one from the UK, and now you can see that that download has started. But now that that download has started, we need a way of getting this installed. So what I recommend you use is Rufus if you're on Windows. Rufus is probably one of the most popular USB bootable tools. So it basically makes an ISO, it writes that to a USB stick so we can use it for installation medium. Now, I'm going to download the portable version so I don't have to install it. So I'm just going to click this version here, currently 4.6. Once that's downloaded and the ISO has also finished, we're going to boot up Rufus and we're going to start this. For this process, you are going to need a USB stick. You're going to need something with probably at least sort of 32 gigs of space. So with a USB stick in hand, insert into your computer, and then we want to load up Rufus. So with Rufus loaded up and your USB stick installed, here you can see I've got my Kingston HyperX USB. I want to click on select and I want to choose the ISO file we just downloaded, so that Linux Mint ISO. So when I click that, you'll see here that Linux Mint has been selected and everything else we can use as default. Now when we click start, it's going to remind us that it's going to format this USB stick, and it's also going to ask us in which way do we want to write this. Now for Linux images, I always find the DD, the direct disk mode, is the way to do it, because I've tried with the ISO mode and it's failed a number of times. So we want to write with DD image mode. I think what that does is copies the whole thing across the whole drive. So we're going to click OK. It's going to warn us it's going to destroy it. We're going to hit OK. And like it says down here, this may take a little while to write. So I'm going to skip ahead and I'll see you on the other side. So once that's completed, it will simply look like this. It will go back to the original format you had the application in. So now we're ready to eject that USB safely and we can begin the installation process. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be using a separate device for this, just because I want to keep this segregated, and also because of that issue I mentioned before, whereby my stream camera doesn't actually work on Linux at the moment, and that's something I'll document later in the series. So I'm going to be using the Minis Forum MSA1 for this, which I've covered in a previous video. And the beauty of that device is it has several NVMe drives. So I'm easily going to be able to install both Windows and Linux on different drives on the same device. So with the USB stick inserted into my MSA1, I've entered the BIOS. Now, everyone's BIOS is going to be a little bit different, but the fundamental principle is you want to be able to boot from that USB stick. But before we do that, like I mentioned in the introduction, we want to make sure that we remove our Windows drive first, just to be on the safe side. Yes, I've mentioned before, you can dual boot this off a single drive, and yes, you can technically install this with a second drive in on the other drive, but let's take any complications out of the process. So if I actually head into my boot options, you'll see that I've got this Kingston drive here. This is my existing Windows disk, so this has Windows on. So I'll just boot into that for now to show you, just so that we can see this in action. So that's going to start booting now into Windows. Here you can see I've got Windows already installed. What I'm now actually going to do is log in, I'm going to power it down, and then once I've powered it down, I'm going to actually remove the disk drive. We're then going to install Linux Mint. It might be a good idea as well to run that in live mode just to make sure you haven't got any hardware issues, but we can come on to that later. So here you can see I've got my machine, everything's installed, Windows 11 as you'd expect. So instead this time I'm going to do what I just said. I'm going to shut this machine down. I'm then going to remove the disk drive that my Windows installation's on, and then I'll see you in a moment. So now that I've removed the disk that has Windows installed and I've inserted my USB stick, if we go to the boot options, we shouldn't see anything there. No. Well, we do see the Kingston because that's my USB stick, but we don't see the Kingston NVMe drive that had Windows on. We also don't see the Samsung in there. That's because it doesn't have anything to boot on it. It's a blank drive. So what we need to do now is basically to go into our BIOS. And again, like I say, this will be different for each one. But effectively, if you've got a shortcut as well, sometimes it's F11. And what that allows you to do is basically temporarily override what's hard-coded into your BIOS. So for instance, I could click on this now and it would boot from the USB stick, which is that Linux Mint installation. Or if you want something that's going to be persistent between boots, what you'd actually have to do is go into your setup and then click on something like your boot options, and then you'll want to select from here what it is. So for instance, in this case, I'm always having my USB device as my boot device because I'm installing OSs quite frequently. My boot option 2 is then the NVMe drive. Now, this isn't specific at the moment, and what you can actually do is to scroll down, and I can go into the boot priorities for those devices, and I would be able to select it here. Now on your BIOS, basically you just want to make sure that whichever drive you want to boot first in the future, so that will be after you've got both these drives back in, you'll want to select the one that, if you want to mainly drive Windows, you'd probably put your Windows drive here. But hey, this is Linux, we want to put our Linux NVMe drive here. So for now, just because I've got the one in there, remember I've removed my Windows device, I'm going to leave as is. Now I should be able to go back because the USB device is going to get picked up by default. And I should just be able to boot this up. So if I just hit boot, that's going to basically skip me going into the BIOS, and I should be presented with a nice black screen. So here we have the first instance of Linux Mint. And what it's asking us here is, how do we want to start this up? Now remember, when you first boot this up, it's actually going to be running off the USB drive. So this isn't installing, it's a bit like if you've ever installed Windows first. So I'm going to skip all of the other options and I'm just going to start this one normally. It might be a good idea if you've experienced some problems to go with compatibility mode, but I've not seen that on any devices I've tried to install this on. So hitting that, like I say, it's going to be booting now into live mode with Linux Mint. Now the good thing about this is you can basically test your hardware before you install. And what I mean by that is you should be able to see things like devices on your machine, and you should be able to perform some simple tasks, web browsing, etc. It's a bit like a try before you buy. I do recommend that even if things don't necessarily work perfectly with the live, give it an install and see. It might be pulling down some third-party drivers, etc., which could help you out. Now, one thing that's really handy is right from the get-go, we can actually go to the display settings and we can actually change the resolution that we're working with, or the resolution scale. So I'm going to bump this up to 300 so you guys can see. So now with that sorted, we get our first little taster of what Linux Mint looks like. And surprise, surprise, it's pretty Windows-esque, right? Well, that's a good thing. That's going to help us along our journey. Now, before we actually start the installation, which is as simple as clicking the disk up here, we want to go down to the network connections and just check the settings to make sure that we've got a connection. So here you can see I picked up an IP address. That looks about right. And I can also see that my DNS servers are selected correctly. That's because when we do the installation, you don't technically need an internet connection, but it's pretty handy because it will help to pull down third-party drivers, etc., which will just make the experience a bit better when we get on the other side. Drivers, etc. are already there. So without further ado, and if you wanted to, you could obviously have a browse through, you could load up things like Firefox, you could jump into the terminal, you could try out some of the applications. Do bear in mind if it feels a bit sluggish, it is still running off that USB stick. But let's get on with it, let's install Linux Mint. So all we need to do is double click the little disk up there. That'll take a little bit of time to load up, but eventually you'll be greeted with the wizard. So from here, we want to select our language and hit continue. Select your keyboard and continue again. And then we're asked if we want to install any multimedia codecs. Now, I don't know why you wouldn't want to do this. There could be some reason, I'm not certain, but I'm going to be looking at playing video on this, and I'm also wanting to view websites. So if that's going to help, I'm going to install those codecs. After that, you could see down there, it was actually saying it was preparing some drivers. Now, what do we want to do? Now, because I've removed that drive, I've only got one disk available to Linux Mint. If I'd left my Windows disk in here, I would actually have some additional options. I could do a dual boot scenario, and what that would do is give me another bubble here to select, and it would guide me through a slightly separate wizard whereby I could actually select how much disk space I want to steal from that Windows machine. Effectively, you'll just have a little slider, and like I said, check out the Learn Linux TV if you want to go down that route. I want to keep this discrete. So there is an option to do something else. So for example, if we click that and continue, we get the option to basically set this out and partition it exactly as we want to. Now, I'm really keen to keep this simple for now. So I'm just going to go with erase the disk and install Linux Mint. There are some additional advanced features if you want to. So you can use LVM. That's a different kettle of fish compared to what we're going to be using, which is ext4. I might go into LVM later. LVM is good, especially if you've got multiple drives and you want to be able to have logical volume management. It basically makes them all kind of virtual-esque, like a bit like a VM, whereby you can expand partitions dynamically, you can move them between disks, etc. And there are quite a few advantages to that. But if we're just trying to keep this simple and get onto Linux, I'm going to keep it to using ext4, which is pretty similar to how Windows does things. It's going to create partitions just on that single disk, and it's designed basically for a single disk setup. We might come back to that in the future if that's something we want to have a look at. LVMs are pretty handy. I have covered them previously in virtual machines. So let's install now. What that's going to do is basically wipe the disk, and is going to format all the existing partitions, anything that's on there. So do beware, this is the point of no return. If you've got something on there, do make sure you go and check, it will get wiped. But I'm going to hit continue because I don't care about what's on there. It's then going to guide me through basically the customization of Linux Mint while it's doing the installation in the background. So London, that looks about right. And then it's going to ask me for my name and some details. So let's just put in some details for this. And naturally, it's given me a good password because obviously I work in security. So it then asks whether you want to require a password to log in or whether you want to log in automatically. That's entirely up to you. Obviously, it's more secure to request a password every time you log in. And you also get the option to encrypt your home folder. Now, I'm not going to do that just for the purpose of this video, but you need to make a decision as to whether or not you want to do that. The benefit of it is if someone to remove the drive from your machine, they wouldn't be able to read the folder contents because it's encrypted. I'll let you decide. So I'm going to hit continue now, and that's going to continue with the installation. What you can actually do is click this little arrow here and you'll see what it's actually doing in the background. Because I've got this network connection set up down here, it will be pulling things from the internet. So it'll be pulling the latest versions of software, basically doing an update during the installation, which is pretty good and makes sure that when you do boot this up for the first time, you've got all the latest and greatest software. So that shouldn't take too much longer now to install, and when it does, I'll see you at the end. Now you can see that it's retrieved a load of files from the internet. It's pulling down those latest updates. This shouldn't take too long. It's then going to install some language packs and clear up all the leftover installation files. And fingers crossed, any minute now, we should be at the end of the installation and we're ready for the next step. So now the installation has completed and we're asked if we want to continue testing, i.e. continue running off the USB stick and playing around. And if you do, go for it, but I'm going to hit the restart. Now when I hit restart, it's going to complain and ask me to remove the USB stick. That's obviously a good thing because it's set as my primary boot device. So I'm going to head now, I'm going to remove the USB stick, and I'm also going to put back in my Windows disk again. So then I'll have both hard drives, each with a different OS installed, and safe in the knowledge that we haven't messed with any of the boot managers. So I'll see you in a minute. So now I'm back in the BIOS. I've got both of those drives plugged in and I've got no USB stick. So hopefully if I click boot options, yes, you can now see that I've got Ubuntu. That's been under the hood on that Samsung drive, and I've also now got the Windows boot manager on my Kingston drive, obviously for Windows. So now we have the awesome prospect of choosing which one we want to boot from, and as I said, you'd be able to go back now into your proper BIOS settings here and choose which one you actually want to boot from most frequently. So here I've got that NVMe set to Ubuntu, which is going to be my first drive, but I could also set it to Windows if I wanted to. If I go down to here, NVMe drive priorities, you can say which one you want. This will be different for your BIOS, but for example, if I want default boot to Windows, I put that as option 1 and this one as option 2. So let's just quickly test that out. So now checking my boot options, I'm going to drag the Windows from the top, just so it's the first one it's going to boot from, and then hitting OK, I should be able to click boot. That should now boot up, and it should go straight into Windows. Fingers crossed, yeah, and there we go. We're back into Windows. That's exactly what I expected it to look like. So now I should be able to log in. If this was my real device, I'd see all of my applications and everything here. We can see that this is running on the same machine through the device manager. And so now we're in a position where let's reboot this. One cool thing is we can actually run some tests on here as well, because we've got basically both OSs non-virtualized on the same hardware. And I'll comment to that in subsequent videos. But let's now just shut this down and restart. And instead, this time, I'm going to boot into Linux Mint and we're going to have our first look at that operating system. So this time, just going to shuffle around the boot devices. I did actually find that it wasn't always sticking the shortcut way. So this time, yeah, let's get the Ubuntu at the top, the Windows Boot Manager second. I'm going to save and exit that, save and exit those changes. And hopefully now that's going to reboot and we should get our first glimpse of Linux Mint. And if anything goes right, it should be logging in, asking us for a password. You're seeing all of this in real time as well, so you should get a feel for just how quick this is. So really fast on that initial login. So let me put in my username and password, and hopefully it will be greeted with the desktop. So yeah, there we go. We're in. Look how simple that is. So let me just sort out the display settings again so that you can actually read this stuff. Hopefully that should make life easier. So now I've bumped up the display resolution and it's a welcome to Linux Mint. So I'm going to untick that because I don't want it to show every time. But let's go. Let's see what we can do. So first of all, it's going to take you through and have a look at some things you might want to install. I'm not going to go through any of this stuff. I'm going to do a second video where we go through the initial configuration. But now you've basically got your desktop. It looks pretty much like Windows. You've got all your task stuff down in the bottom right. You've got applications pinned to the bottom left, and you've got a start menu that looks pretty much like the good old trusted Windows 10. So I'm going to leave it there, guys, and I'll be setting up another video soon. I'm also going to do a live stream, probably around doing this in live, so you can actually click and follow along and ask questions. But I'll see you on the next video where we actually go through and take our first look at Linux Mint and how we can actually get some common applications installed. If there's things that you do want to see on Linux Mint and you want to ask me how to do it, drop a comment down below and I'll try my best to get onto it again. I'm quite new to this as well, so please, any suggestions if I can't answer, do let me know and I'll try and incorporate that into a video. So awesome, we're up and running, we're now on Linux Mint, and you've also got your Windows boot drive safe in the knowledge that all your data is retained, and also you've got all of that productivity at hand should you need it, just with the simple case of rebooting. Now we have all the tools ready to play. So in the next video, I'm going to walk us through what Linux Mint is and give you my overall impression of some of the things I found that work really well. There are a lot of them, and some of the troubles that I've had which I'm still yet to resolve. Hence why I'm still recording on this machine. But all of that will become clear in the next video. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you've got any questions, please put them below. Please do get vocal on the Discord and also put some things up on the GitHub if you think that's useful. Anyway, I hope by the next time I see you, you're living the Linux dream, and I'll see you soon. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.